Hey, what's up, everybody? This is the first part of a new series where I'm going to be reviewing books. We'll call it Book Reviews, the series. This is the last book I read, Negative Space by B.R. Yeager. This is the kind of fictional novel that you would find filed under horror in the store. It's a little bit different than what I'd gotten accustomed to in reading horror. I don't read very much of it, though. I know a lot of the classics, so I've got kind of a shaky foundation. I know Lovecraft and King and a handful of in-betweeners. This is something pretty different, though. It's a lot more recent. You find references in here to image boards and emojis. The story revolves around 4 high school kids. They're about to graduate when the story starts. They're in a little town in New Hampshire, if I remember right. And there's all kinds of suicides happening. Gets off to a pretty grisly start. The kids seem to be generally pretty wrecked. They're emotionally distant. The sense of longing actually comes through pretty strongly in these kids. As you read about them, they really reach for connections, meaningful connections with people, and it all gets muddled up and filtered through their drug parties and weird hookups and just all kinds of stuff that I'd consider pretty unorthodox and strange, but it all comes off feeling really realistic, which is part of what makes it especially gross. I'm not really talking about super viscerally gross, like you get out of some slasher type stuff, but I guess gross in the way that you really feel bad as you imagine what's happening to the people in the book. It's not all kids; there are a handful of adults, and one of the things that makes this especially scary, because it is scary, it's a pretty scary book, it got me spooked decently. Not necessarily because I'm conceiving of myself in the scenarios in which the protagonists found themselves frightened and struggling, but just because I actually felt sorry for what the people were going through, which is unusual to me for a horror novel, I think. Once again, I'm not really versed in the whole genre. But the adults that show up as characters in the book, they seem to be much worse off than do a lot of the kids, because they are basically the terminal point of the left hand path that these kids are looking down as they're at a crossroads. They don't want to go that way. They see the results of going down that path and living your life broken and disconnected, not just from robust personal relationships with people, but reality as a whole. So I'm not sure if the actual horror that takes place in this book is supposed to be a metaphorical representation of that, of what happens to people who succumb to their trauma, but it kind of comes off that way. All in all, there's not really much of a solid point made, at least not explicitly, in the book. There's not even really a serious any serious hero or villain character. The character Tyler is kind of the focal point that the story revolves around, and he's gotten into some pretty far out stuff. Some kind of magic ritual he uses, paired with a drug, which so far as I can tell is imaginary. There is a lot of real drug usage in here. The kids are often buying they're buying oxys, they're buying weed, they're buying other stuff that isn't named, but has a seemingly pretty realistic effect on their behavior and cognizance and everything. But there's a fictional drug here that, when paired with some magical rituals that are also imaginary, so far as I know, seem very realistic. And the effects that the usage of this drug and ritual come to is something like communication with the dead. So it's eventually revealed that the rash of suicides that is kind of the kicking off point that this all starts with is paired with the drug use and the magic, because the line between living and dead personae becomes fuzzier and fuzzier as the story goes on, and the mechanics and functionality of all this stuff is left pretty vague by the author. It's no kind of shortcoming. It actually makes things much more interesting to read about, because there's a couple times you'll come across stuff like, is he really dead? Like, you saw him die, why is he here talking to people now? Well, did you really see him die? Is he really here talking to people? The sanity of the characters is questionable pretty much through the whole thing, and not in the kind of way that you might see in something like Lovecraft, where there's a pretty clear line between a rational person and then a person in denial about what they're seeing, and then a person who has had to accept what they're seeing and lost their rational faculties as a result. Instead, there's a lot of that unreliable narrator thing going on, and while Tyler is the focal point, the actual narrative comes from 3 other different characters, and one of them seems relatively normal. One of them is they're all relatively normal compared to Tyler, who is into some pretty extreme stuff. He's all into cutting his body up, and of course this weird ritual magic thing, and it seems to be spreading and manifesting as violence and insanity in their hometown. The suicides are just the beginning of it. It gets quite a bit stranger afterward. You get into some shared dream stuff. A lot of information is shared over this particular message board that one of the characters reads a lot. This character also appears to be a synesthete. I'm not sure if I said that right, but basically somebody who experiences there's sensory input bleeding over into one another. So things like touch, smell, and taste aren't necessarily relegated to a sense that you can pick out individually. So their narrative is pretty interesting. There also seems to be something of time travel happening, where one of the characters, and as I'm talking about this, I'm trying hard not to spoil anything, because I think that while this doesn't rely on twists, it's the constant unfolding of the event that really gives this album a lot of listen to me, gives this book a lot of momentum, an unusual amount of momentum. I blew through this sucker in just a couple of days because I was hooked pretty quickly. It's easy reading. The passages aren't particularly challenging, but they are unique in a kind of a special way. Because it's something like poetry, but it's not necessarily written to exploit the the potential beauty of language. It borders on abusive language at sometimes, is what I'm going to say. All the characters' interactions are realistic, and they talk like you'd expect 17-year-olds to talk today. But actually, the one thing that it reminded me of, I'm kind of a casual peruser of the old school screamo bands and stuff like that, and they have a style of writing lyrics that is something that kept coming to me as I was reading this. It's real similar because it's descriptive but abstract at the same time. I don't know, that sounds a little bit contradictory, but that's kind of the theme of the whole thing, is this contradiction between the unconscious experience and the reality that you see outside of you that you think you're sharing with everybody else. But it's delimited for sure at a certain point. Your experience versus other people's experience. One of the things that kind of trembles underneath this whole atmosphere is that that unspoken, maybe even unspeakable knowing that your perspective is strictly exclusive, and you're never quite able to get to that point where you can affirm for yourself through someone else what life is, what things are, what's happening around you. But so the style of prose definitely facilitates that, in that it's kind of activating the two, well, if you can conceive of it this way, but like the two antipodes of the mind, where one's rational and analyzing, and the other one is almost totally given over to the impulses and persuasion of suggestions. So you get paragraphs like this: "She isn't here anymore. Hasn't been for a long time. But he is. I'm finding him deep inside the woods, dancing in a fire's orange and night's black. He's pulling pieces of my body through a hole in his pocket, out into his fists. He flicks my pieces into the flame. My ears, my eyes, my teeth, my nose. My voice disappears. My elbows and kneecaps pull out of their sockets. I collapse. My limbs go away like they were never there to begin with. My head splits open and my brain falls into dirt, glass, and pine needles. Some nights that would be all I remembered after waking up, and he'd either be next to me or I'd find him standing at the window, staring out at a pink-gray sunrise, fingers pressed to the glass. I'd pretend to stay asleep, waiting for him to return, so I could feel the stringy muscles beneath his skin and taste the gray sour on his teeth, but he'd just stay there, staring at the sky." So, as you do read this, you have to kind of get away from the type of intellectual headspace that you'd be in when reading something a little bit more traditionally narrated, and it's more about letting the impressions kind of wash over you. So, a good book? I think that in these reviews, in this new series that I'm doing, called this new series of book reviews that I'm doing, I'm not really going to come down on one side or the other about whether a book is good. If there are errors or like objective shortcomings, then I'll point those out. Oh, better get on that actually. There is one line in this book that seems to have been twice pasted in the text. I don't think that was an artistic thing. I think it was just a sentence happened to get copied in there twice. Some kind of printing error, possibly. Otherwise, it's great. You don't run into misspellings. You don't run into weird shifts in style or anything like that. It's very consistent, and there's an undercurrent of subtle alarm running through the whole thing, which really, really impels you to keep reading. Like I said, not because of the twists, because I'll be honest, it's not that kind of book. You're not really invested in that kind of interpersonal drama. Although there is plenty of it, it's rather glossed over, and it's really more about the disintegration of the stuff that we take for granted as kind of the substrate of our reality, social reality. So rather than giving this a thumbs up or thumbs down, I'll just say if any of that struck a chord with you at all, then probably going to be a good read for you. I am going to read some more Yeager. I did like this one, Negative Space by B.R. Yeager. He has a couple other books out. I'm not sure if they're still in the same, like, I don't know, modern horror, postmodern horror. I'll go ahead and give this the postmodern seal of approval, I guess. I don't know, man. I don't know. Hard to describe a thing like this. So that probably tells you enough. It is a unique read. It was interesting. I blew through it very quickly. At the end, I felt pretty cut up inside. It was not really an emotional roller coaster, and it didn't frighten me. I wasn't thinking about creepy, ghouly things stalking around outside my house at night when it was done. But it's a pretty weighty, nihilistic, oh, you know, what's the word for that? It's an inundation, man. You get sucked into it, quicksand style. So, pretty good book to me. I really didn't like it, but was super into it. And I guess that concludes my first episode. Stick around for more, and if you have a book that you want to see me trip over this borderline nonsensical stream of consciousness style of pseudo description, then keep it to yourself. I don't care, man. I read what I want.